Rapa Nui is an island. It's known as Easter Island. It's a lonely place, with these stone giants fallen across the landscape, a mystery written in stone. European sailors arrived there. They found a wasteland. They found a broken people, but that was a shock because the society that carved those statues, that society had been thriving. It had been something else entirely, and the reason that civilization crumbled, the true reason, it's a sobering one. It speaks directly to challenges we face now. This isn't a story about aliens. It isn't about one single disaster. It's a slow unraveling, centuries long. What you see is an ecological suicide, an entire society making choices. Choices that led them to consume the very foundation of their own survival. So we follow the clues, scientific clues, from what was once lush forest down to barren rock. From grand ambition all the way to desperate conflict, the Moai are silent, but they hold a warning for everyone. What does it mean for a civilization to be sustainable? Truly sustainable, that's the question they leave us with. Their story starts with a miracle of navigation. Around the year 1200, a great double-hulled canoe came over the horizon. Its sails were woven from pandanus leaves. The people on board were Polynesians. They were the greatest explorers of the ancient world. They navigated by the stars, by the ocean swells, by watching the paths of birds. After a journey of unimaginable distance, they finally saw land. What they found was a paradise. They called it Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world. We know it as Rapa Nui, Easter Island. It wasn't a barren rock. It was a lush green jewel. The island was covered by a vast forest of giant palm trees, a species found nowhere else. These trees towered. Their trunks were thicker than a person is tall. The understory was dense with shrubs and ferns. The coastline teemed with life. Dozens of seabird species nested there, in colonies so thick they darkened the sky. It was a sanctuary. The soil was rich volcanic ash, profoundly fertile. For those first settlers, it must have felt like the culmination of their ancestors' boldest dreams. They brought the essential plants of their culture, preserved in the hull of their canoe. Sweet potato, taro, banana, sugar cane. They brought chickens, their only domesticated animal. They stepped onto a shore of abundance. The early centuries were probably a time of careful balance. The forest gave wood for homes, for canoes to fish the rich waters. The birds gave meat and eggs and feathers. The soil gave bountiful harvests. The population grew slowly, in harmony with the island's rhythms. That was the foundation, the solid ground everything would be built on. It was a world of plenty, a world that must have felt eternal, endlessly forgiving. But as civilization's ambitions grow, and they can grow faster than the trees, the island had reached a point of abundance, and from that, a different ambition started to grow. The clans, the Mata, they began to compete, but not with weapons. They competed with stone. It was a spiritual rivalry centered on this idea of mana. A sacred power, a prestige, connecting the living to their ancestors who had become gods. To show this mana, they used the rock of the island itself. They began to carve, and from the volcanic quarry at Raraku, the Moai emerged. These weren't just monuments. Each statue was a sacred vessel. It was meant to hold the living essence, the mana, of a powerful ancestor. You'd erect a Moai on a coastal platform, an ahu, and in doing that, you were turning an ancestor into a guardian. The statue faced inland to bless the community, to provide fertility and protection. The bigger the statue, the more elaborate the ahu, the greater the clan's power, spiritual power, social power. This became the cultural engine, a project that lasted centuries. The scale of it, a single average Moai weighs about as much as 50 family cars. the largest one they ever tried, left unfinished in the quarry, would have weighed nearly 300 cars. And they had to move them for miles across hills to these coastal platforms, without wheels, without large animals. The leading theory points to organized human effort. They'd carve the statue at the quarry, then transport it upright in a kind of rocking, walking motion, using a system of ropes, a team pulling from the front, others steadying it from behind. That would have required vast amounts of strong rope, made from the bark of the hawhau tree, and to get the statue down from the quarry onto its path, they'd need a smooth roadway. Probably built from the trunks of the island's giant palms, used as rollers, as sledges. The statue cult became the central project of their society. It bound communities together. This shared, prestigious endeavor defined their identity, their connection to the gods. For generations it worked, it created purpose. Unity, a breathtaking landscape, but this spiritual ambition had a physical cost. Every statue moved meant more trees cut down for rollers, for levers. Every rope made meant more trees stripped of their bark. The demand for resources was constant, and it grew. Each generation sought to outdo the last. Bigger monuments, the drive for prestige was now linked directly to the consumption of the island's foundation. The forest that welcomed their ancestors was being transformed into the very engines of their ambition. The trees were the engine of the island. Those tall palms, they weren't just part of the view. They were the basic technology for everything. To move one of those statues, you needed a smooth path, so they'd cut down logs and use them as rollers. They'd lay them down and use the big trunks to move the statue forward, inch by inch. And every statue they moved meant dozens of trees just for that one trip. The ropes they used to pull and steady the statues, those were made from the bark of another tree, the hawhau. But the trees weren't just for the statues, they were for survival. These people came from the ocean. Their first voyage to the island was in a big canoe carved from one massive log. To build boats like that, to keep a fleet for fishing the deep water for tuna, you needed large, straight timber, and as the biggest palms were cut down, that ability disappeared. The canoes got smaller. They were made from patched-together pieces. They couldn't go out into the deep ocean safely anymore. The islanders were losing their link to the sea, their main source of protein beyond the shore. And at home, wood was everything. It built the houses and the meeting spaces. It was the fuel for every fire, for cooking, for warmth. The demand never stopped, generation after generation. So we know this happened because the island kept a record. Scientists have taken cores from the sediment in the volcanic lakes. Those layers, like pages, hold ancient pollen that's been preserved. By looking at these pollen cores, you can see what plants were growing at any time. The story is clear. In the deepest, oldest layers, pollen from the giant palm is everywhere. It's dominant. Then, as you move up through the centuries, that pollen starts to thin out. It gets fainter. Other plants show up, smaller species that grow in open, disturbed ground. The timeline shows a steady decline over hundreds of years. This wasn't one big fire or a sudden decision to cut everything. It was a slow, creeping use. Each generation took what it needed from the forest, and maybe a little more, thinking it would last forever. But trees grow slowly. They were being cut down faster than new ones could grow to full size. It was like spending more than you have, a death by 1,000 cuts. The loss was so gradual that someone living their whole life there might not have seen it. You'd just notice the groves were farther away. The logs for your house weren't as thick. The canoes didn't last as many seasons. The foundation of their world was being worn away steadily. And when a foundation crumbles, everything on top of it starts to tilt. The forest was a shield, and when it was gone, the island was naked. Those giant palm trees, they did more than just give wood. They held the landscape together. Their roots were a living net gripping the volcanic soil. Their canopy broke the force of the rain. It softened the wind. With the trees gone, that protection vanished. The elements were free to work on the bare ground. When the rains came, they didn't soak in. They hit the earth like a hammer. They became runoff, carving gullies through the topsoil, carrying the island's fertility straight into the ocean. The wind, always blowing, now picked up the dry soil and just blew it away. This was a quiet catastrophe. You couldn't hear it, but you could see the results. The deep, dark soil that had fed generations was thinning. What was left was rocky. Less fertile, harder to farm, the land was becoming poorer right when people needed it most. Agriculture became a desperate battle. The sweet potato, their staple, needed good soil and shelter. So the islanders engineered a solution. The manavai, circular stone windbreaks, low walls. Inside these rings, they made micro-gardens. The stones sheltered plants from the wind. They conserved moisture. They gathered any new soil that washed down. Building the manavai was backbreaking work. Thousands of stones gathered and stacked. It was a sign. Simple farming didn't work anymore. The environment was now an adversary to be managed, not a partner. And even with this adaptation, the yields were dropping. Each acre produced less food than it had before. So to feed the same number of people, they had to cultivate more acres, clear more land, even marginal land. Which only made the erosion worse. It was a trap, a vicious cycle. The solution to one problem made the next problem more severe. This was the turning point. The pivot from gradual decline to crisis. The population of Rapa Nui reached its highest point right when the environment was most fragile. More people than ever, depending on a landscape that couldn't support them in the old ways. The margin for error was gone. A single bad growing season, a drought, could now mean real hardship. The great societal project, the statue construction, demanded huge effort. It required people to be fed while they worked on spiritual matters. That social contract was built on a foundation of agricultural surplus, and that surplus was disappearing. Washed out to sea with the last of the good soil, the stage was set. When the basic equation of survival becomes so precarious, when there's not enough to easily go around, what happens to the bonds that hold a society together? The unity that built the Moai would soon be tested by a darker, more desperate kind of competition. The forest went quiet, and that silence spread. It moved through everything. The animals started to disappear. That was the third pressure on them, maybe the worst one. The whole system that fed them was breaking. It started with the deep water. Those big canoes, remember, made from one tree, they were gone. So that whole way of fishing, it ended. They were sailors, but they had no boats, not for the open ocean. The big fish out past the reef tuna, dolphin, that food was gone. The protein was gone. They had to stay in the shallow lagoons, and those lagoons, they didn't have much. They got fished out fast. On the island itself, it was clearer. Every bird that lived only on that island, every single one, went extinct. The undergrowth was cleared for crops. The birds lost their cover, their food, seeds and insects. It got scarce, and people hunted them. They just vanished, one after another, until there were none. Then it moved to the seabirds, the cliffs and the rocks offshore. They used to be covered in birds, huge colonies. For the first people, it was like a pantry. Just go and collect, but as people grew in number and as other food ran out, the pressure got too high. They took too many. And the rats that came with them, they ate the eggs. They ate the chicks, the skies. Over time they emptied. The flocks didn't come back, so what did they have left? Their diet shrank. It came down to two things. Chickens, they brought chickens. Chickens became so important they built stone forts to keep them safe. And then the other source, the bones tell you. The later bones, they have cut marks on them, marks from removing meat. It points to one thing. When the famine was worst, they did what people everywhere do when there's nothing else. This wasn't a quick fall. It was the last sign. The food web was gone. Every backup was gone. They had lived from the forest, the gardens, the deep sea, the sky. Now it was just this thin, fragile line. They went from a system that could take a hit to one that couldn't. There was no room left, so when the next bad thing happened, a dry year, a failed crop, there was nowhere to go. That's when everything else started to come apart. The life support was failing, and at that exact moment, they were building statues at their most intense, most extravagant pace. That's the paradox. It's what gets called cultural inertia, the momentum of a way of life continuing long after the reasons for it are gone, like a ship. Engines still at full speed while the fuel is running out. The crew is focused on the course, on the prestige of that speed. They ignore the warnings. For them, the statue cult was the engine. It was their identity, their connection to the gods. All social status came from it. To stop would be unthinkable. It would mean their ancestors were wrong. It would mean collapse. So as the trees vanished, as the soil washed away, they didn't pull back. The evidence says they doubled down. Competition for that sacred prestige, the mana, probably got more intense, not less. When things are scarce, controlling the ancestors' favor seems more vital. If crops fail, you build a bigger guardian. If the ocean's empty, you erect a more imposing monument to plead for abundance. This is when the largest moai were likely carved. Moved, the quarry shows statues never finished, left in the rock, colossal. One they call El Gigant, over 70 feet long, would have weighed close to 300 tons. Moving, that would have consumed a forest. This wasn't sustainable creation anymore. This was a desperate gamble. The energy that built the civilization was now poured into a ritual competition. A competition that was destroying its foundation. Every log used as a roller for a new giant was a piece of the future, burned for a symbol. Every rope from the last trees was a final investment in a belief system that couldn't feed them anymore. The disconnect was total. They could see the changes, the barren hills, the struggling gardens, but the story they told themselves about who they were and what they must do was too powerful to change. The path was set when a society's deepest traditions become its greatest threat, when the solution to every problem is to do more of what caused it. The outcome is almost mathematical. The strain had to break something, and what broke next wasn't the rock in the quarries. It was the fabric of the community itself. The statues fell. That collapse, the clearest sign of it isn't in what they built. It's in what they destroyed. Across the island, those great stone ancestors were pulled down on purpose. Toppled from their platforms, faces smashed into the ground. For a people who put centuries of labor and belief into these figures, that was unthinkable. It was a declaration of war, not against a rival clan, but against the spiritual order itself, the one that held their world together. When cooperation breaks down, the tools of creation turn into weapons. Archaeologists find these thousands of sharp, triangular tools, made of obsidian, the volcanic glass. They call them mata. For a long time, they were thought to be spear points. But their shape is odd for a spear. They're not made to penetrate deeply. They're made to slash, to cut. They were likely the blades of hand-to-hand weapons for close, brutal conflict. The sheer number of them tells a story, a society arming itself, and the bones tell a quieter story, a more chilling one. Studies of remains from the later period show a big increase in signs of violence. Cranial fractures from blunt force, parry fractures on forearm bones, the kind you get raising your arm to block a blow. These aren't the marks of a rare ritual duel. They're the marks of widespread, desperate fighting. What were they fighting over? In the end, it was about the basics. With the forests gone, there was no new land to claim. The productive soil was confined to smaller patches protected by those stone garden walls. Fresh water sources were limited. The chicken forts became strongholds. The competition wasn't for spiritual prestige anymore. It was for physical survival. The old clan alliances, the social contracts that mobilized hundreds to move a statue, they shattered. It was every group for itself. That internal strife was the final wound, self-inflicted. A society that could once coordinate moving a 100-ton statue across miles of terrain was now fractured into hostile factions. Unable to mount any unified response to the ecological disaster they faced, the very cooperation that built their civilization was now impossible. They were trapped. Conflict over scarce resources made those resources even scarcer. Gardens were raided, stores destroyed. The great unifying project of the Moai had given way to a grim, zero-sum struggle. The ancestors on the Ahu could no longer protect anyone. They were toppled. That broke the covenant between the living and the dead. In their fall, they marked the true end. The end of the world their builders had known. The broken statues gave way to a different kind of god, one made of feathers, a god that could fly. With the old order gone, the people on Rapa Nui built a new faith. The Birdman cult, the Tangata Monu, a total reinvention coming from the barren place they lived in now. The ritual happened every year, a spectacle of desperation. Each spring, when the sooty terns came back to nest on this little islet, Motu Nui, the competition would start. Clans chose their champions. They called them hapu. These weren't priests, they were warriors, athletes. Their task was a trial. They had to climb down the 1,000-foot cliffs of the Rano cow volcano. Then swim through waters full of sharks to reach that distant rock, and then wait for days, sometimes weeks, hiding in caves, waiting for the first tern egg of the season to be laid. The first man to find one, to put it in a headband and swim back to the main island with the egg intact, he won. His clan leader, his patron, was declared the Birdman for the next year. Gained a sacred status, a kind of living king, but it was temporary, only lasted until the next egg was found. That ritual shows you the change. The old religion was about permanence. Carving ancestors into the landscape itself, a project for the ages needing hundreds of people. The Birdman cult was the opposite. It was about transience. The prize was a fragile egg. The champion was one person. The power lasted a single year. A religion stripped down to its essentials for a stripped-down island. They went from worshipping stone giants that took generations to build to venerating a single, delicate symbol of life. A symbol that had to be won again every season. That egg, it represented a tiny piece of the natural world they'd lost. The skies were empty now, the forests gone, the great seabird colonies just a memory. This one egg, from one of the last bird species that still visited, it became the most sacred object on the island. It wasn't about collective creation anymore. It was about individual survival, speed, strength, luck in a harsh place. The ritual channeled the society's competitive energy away from building monuments into a controlled, symbolic contest, a way to decide status without the resource drain of the Moai. In a world with no timber left to move statues, this contest required only human courage. The focus shifted from the ancestors to the immediate, from the eternal to the annual. Their gaze turned outward again, but not to the horizon their ancestors sailed. It was fixed on that one rocky islet, a last remnant of the abundance they'd lost. The Birdman cult was a grim adaptation, brilliant. A society that could no longer afford to build its gods from the earth learned to chase them across the sea. The island still had a rhythm, even weakened. The rains came, the gardens grew, but that rhythm could falter, and when it did, there was nothing left to catch them. The last chapter of their old world, it wasn't written just by them. Nature, in its own cycles, delivered the final blows. Think of a person already very ill. A body that's struggling, a common cold, something a healthy person would shrug off, becomes a crisis. That was Rapa Nui in its final centuries. The society had made itself vulnerable. Critically vulnerable, then the climate changed. Scientists have read this in the mud, core samples from the sediments at the bottom of the volcanic lakes. Those layers are a climate archive. Pollen, charcoal, the chemistry of the mud itself. It reconstructs ancient rainfall, and the data shows sharp droughts. Punishing droughts, periods where the rains failed, not for a season but for decades. One major drought seems to have struck around 1500, right as the statue building was peaking. Another, even more severe, closer to 1700. These weren't gentle dry spells, they were profound shifts, possibly linked to larger patterns, the Little Ice Age, or intensified El Niño events that redirect rainfall across the Pacific. Imagine the impact on that stripped bare landscape, the thin soils baked hard, the freshwater springs already scarce dwindled to a trickle, the stone-walled gardens, the manavai, could only do so much. You can shelter a plant from the wind, but you can't shelter it from having no water. Crop yields already declining would have collapsed, the chickens suffered. The remaining wild food sources vanished. This is where the external shock met the internal fragility. A healthy, resilient society might have weathered a long drought. They would have had stored surpluses from good years. They could have drawn on a diverse food web, forest products, deep sea fish, birds to buffer the loss. They might have coordinated a response, sharing water, relocating people, but Rapa Nui had none of that left. The surpluses were gone, eaten up by the population and the projects. The backup food sources were extinct. The social fabric was already tearing, so the drought didn't just mean less food. It acted as a multiplier on every existing problem. It turned scarcity into absolute shortage. It turned tension into violent conflict. What little fertile land remained, what few reliable water holes became battlegrounds. The competition wasn't for spiritual prestige anymore. It was for a cup of water, for a basket of roots. The evidence of increased violence in the archaeological record aligns perfectly with these periods of climatic stress. The society, hollowed out from within, had no resilience left. It couldn't bend, so it broke. The crucial lesson: the environment didn't kill the Rapa Nui civilization. A stable climate didn't guarantee their survival, and a shifting climate didn't cause their collapse. Their own choices over centuries had dismantled their ability to cope with change. They had consumed their buffers, they had simplified their world until it had no flexibility. The drought was the trigger, but they had spent generations loading the gun. It's a pattern that echoes. What happens when a society becomes so specialized, so dependent on a single way of life, that it loses the capacity to adapt? When the margin for error is erased, the next storm, the next dry spell, becomes an existential threat. The Moai fell in silence, but the warning they carry is for any civilization that forgets how fragile its foundations are. At its peak, before everything came apart, Rapa Nui might have had 15,000 people, maybe more, a whole society spread out across the island. Then the first European ships arrived in 1722. By then, the number had collapsed. Historians think maybe 2,000 were left. This wasn't a slow fade. It was a catastrophe, the final outcome of everything: the broken environment, the fighting, the bad climate, all of it landing on people. The main reason was starvation. The forest was gone, the soil, the birds, the deep sea fish. The diet shrank down to sweet potatoes, and then the droughts came, and even those failed. When you're malnourished, your body weakens. Common illnesses become deadly. What might have been a small sickness in good times could kill you. You see it in the old accounts. Visitors wrote about a thin, struggling people, and you see it in the bones. Studies of remains from the late period show stress, stunted growth in children. A clear sign of not enough food. Then there was the violence, fighting over the last good land, the last fresh water. The bones show more trauma from that time. But maybe worse than the fighting itself was what it did to society. A zero-sum struggle. Trust disappears. Cooperation becomes impossible. That environment of fear and scarcity hits the most basic human act: having children. Birth rates fall. Malnutrition can stop ovulation. The stress of constant uncertainty, of not being able to care for a child, makes people wait or not have families at all. It's a biological and social response. the world feels too hostile for new life. This population crash was a world going out, not just a number. It was the end of family lines that went back to the first canoe. It was the loss of knowledge, how to read the stars for long voyages, the rituals for building the statues, the songs, the stories. Each person lost was a library burning down. The complex society, the carvers, the navigators, the priests, all of it simplified, down to one thing: survival. The survivors who met those European sailors were the remnants, living among the ghosts of their own ambition. The fallen Moai, just stones in the grass now. Their society had been reduced, stripped to the bare essentials. They clung to life on a landscape they had made without meaning to, a barren mirror of their own reduced state. The grandeur was a memory, etched in the statues and in the silence. The empty forests, the empty skies, they had seen the end of their own world. And in that experience there's a question, a deep, unsettling one. What does it take to come back after you've fallen that far? Their world had been remade by scarcity. Then the horizon brought a new storm. Easter Sunday, 1722, a lookout on the cliffs saw shapes. Not clouds, not birds, ships, 3 of them, under a Dutch explorer, Jacob Roggeveen. The arrival was a shock, a breach. Their isolation had lasted over 500 years. The islanders came out in canoes, but they had no large timber left. The vessels were small, patched together. They paddled out to meet these floating mountains. Sails like wings. That first contact was brief, violent, confusing. A misunderstanding led to a clash. Islanders were lost. The Europeans sailed on, but they had opened a door. And that door could never be closed. What followed wasn't conquest. It was something more insidious, a slow invasion, invisible. Over the next century, Spanish and British explorers made stops. They came for water, for supplies, they bartered for food, and each visit left something behind. Microbes, diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis. For a population with no prior exposure, immune systems shaped in total isolation. These weren't just illnesses. They were biological wildfires. The death toll was catastrophic. Communities that had survived famine were decimated by sickness, a sickness they couldn't comprehend. It was a loss on a scale that shattered the social structure. The keepers of oral history, the experts in carving, they were often the first to go. They were in contact with visitors. Each passing took a library of knowledge with it, but the worst was yet to come. The 1860s, a new horror from the sea: Peruvian slave raiders. Ships came specifically to capture people. They swept onto the island. They took around half of the remaining population, the strong, the young, the community leaders. They took them to work in the guano mines off the coast of Peru. A removal so systematic, so cruel, it nearly erased the Rapa Nui people entirely. Within a year or two, due to pressure, a handful of survivors were returned. But they brought back another wave of disease, typhoid likely, tuberculosis. Of the few hundred who came back, only about a dozen lived to step ashore. They brought the final plague with them. These shocks didn't happen in a vacuum. They landed on a society already on its knees. The ecological collapse left no reserves. No food surplus, no social cohesion. A healthy society might have absorbed some of these blows, might have mounted a resistance, but Rapa Nui was fractured. Depleted, vulnerable, the slave raids nearly completed a process that internal mismanagement had begun centuries before. They took the very heart of the community. The people who remembered how things were done, who held the stories of the Moai. With them gone, the last threads connecting the present to the past were severed. The story is often told as an ecological fable, a warning about trees and statues, but its final chapters are a reminder. History is rarely so simple. A society can make choices that weaken it, that strip away its defenses, and then, when the outside world finally arrives, it finds not a fortress, it finds a house with no walls. The Moai had fallen long before the slave ships came, but it was those ships that ensured the civilization that built them would never rise again in the same way. The silence that followed was almost total, broken only by the wind and by the distant memory of what had been lost. The story of Rapa Nui is deeper than the alien myths. It's more unsettling. The Moai didn't fall from a single cataclysm. No force arrived from the stars to wipe things clean. The evidence points to something more ordinary. And more relevant, it was a slow-motion unraveling, a cascade of decisions made over centuries, a society, step by step, consuming the pillars of its own existence. Think of it as a slow leak, not an explosion. Each generation needed wood for homes, for canoes, for the rollers and ropes to move their statues. Each time they cut a tree, it was a rational choice. A necessity for their culture, their economy, their spiritual life. No one cut down the last tree thinking it was the last one. They just took what they needed from a forest that seemed endless. But the timeline in the lake sediments doesn't lie. It shows a decline over hundreds of years, a gradual retreat of the tree line, a steady loss of soil. A slow disappearance of the birds. There was no dramatic event, just the quiet consequence of countless small actions. Now contrast that with the popular tales. The sudden collapse, those stories are compelling. They offer a simple villain, an asteroid, a volcano, visitors from another world. They let the people off the hook. But the archaeological record tells a different tale, more challenging. It shows a society deeply connected to its environment, making choices within a belief system that worked brilliantly. Until it didn't, the shift from balance to crisis was so slow, almost invisible to anyone living through it. A child might grow up seeing a hillside a little barer than their grandparents remembered. But the overall story of their world would feel constant. The real danger wasn't a monster from the outside. It was the inability to see the long-term trajectory of their own way of life. So the story of Easter Island isn't a simple mystery, not one solved with a fantastical answer. It's a case study in sustainability, or the lack of it. The islanders weren't foolish. They were ingenious, resilient, deeply spiritual. Their tragedy was the disconnect between their immediate cultural needs and the long-term capacity of their isolated home. They optimized for prestige and spiritual power in the present, while inadvertently mortgaging their future. The lesson isn't about blaming them, it's about recognizing a pattern. Where the benefits of a choice are immediate and clear, but the costs are distant, diffuse, easy to ignore until it's too late, the silence of the fallen Moai speaks to that tendency. That human tendency, it asks us to look at our own world, our own resources, our own seemingly rational choices, and to wonder what slow leaks we might be ignoring right now. We know this from evidence. It's a case built on clues gathered from the island. To understand what happened, you look at the methods we have now, ways to read a history that isn't written in words. It's in layers of mud, in fragments of bone, in the chemistry of the soil. It starts with something like pollen. The volcanic lakes on the island, they're like time capsules. Every year, a fine dust settles on the water, pollen from plants, charcoal from fires, tiny soil particles. They drift down and form a new layer on the bottom. Over centuries, these layers stack up. Scientists use a tool called a core, a hollow tube they drive into the lakebed mud. They pull up a core sample. A vertical slice through time. The deepest layers are the oldest. By analyzing the pollen grains in each layer, they can reconstruct the plant life at any point in the past. That's how we know about the Great Palm Forest. In the oldest layers, palm pollen is everywhere. Then, as you move up through the centuries, it dwindles. It's replaced by pollen from grasses and shrubs, plants that grow in open, disturbed ground. This isn't an opinion, it's a graph, a timeline of change written in microscopic grains. To put dates on that timeline, we use radiocarbon dating. When a plant or animal is alive, it absorbs a tiny, constant amount of radioactive carbon from the air. When it dies, that stops. The radioactive carbon begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring what's left in a piece of charcoal from an ancient fire or in a bone from a bird, scientists can calculate how long ago that organism died. It gives us a calendar. We can say this layer of mud full of palm pollen is from the year 1200. This layer with almost no palm pollen but lots of charcoal is from 1500. The timeline becomes solid. We can match the ecological changes to the human story. Then there are the tools, those thousands of obsidian blades, the mata. Researchers don't just count them, they study them under microscopes. They look for wear patterns along the edges. The way a blade is damaged tells you how it was used. Was it for scraping wood, for cutting plants, or for sawing through something tough like flesh and bone? The wear patterns on many of these tools suggest they were used as weapons. For cutting and slashing, this turns a pile of sharp stones into evidence of conflict. It tells us about the social climate and what did they eat. The story of their shrinking world is in their garbage. In ancient cooking pits and waste mounds, archaeologists find animal bones. In the early layers, you find bones from dolphins, tuna, many species of land birds. A diverse menu. In the later layers, that variety vanishes. The bones are almost entirely from chickens and from rats. The diet had collapsed down to the last available sources. Even the soil tells a story. Scientists can test chemical isotopes in ancient soil samples. Different plants leave different chemical signatures. By reading these, they can tell if a field was once a forest or if it was heavily farmed. They can see the depletion of nutrients over time. This mosaic of evidence, pollen, dates, tool marks, bones, soil fits together. Each piece supports the others. It transforms the mystery from a legend into a data-driven narrative. We're not imagining their downfall. We're reading it page by page from the book of the earth itself. That scientific confidence is what makes the story powerful. It's not a fable, it's a report from the past. The quarry at Raraku, it's a place that feels frozen. And the most haunting evidence is right there. Dozens of moai left unfinished, still in the rock. They're in every stage. Some are just outlines on the cliff. Others are almost free, connected by just a thin spine of stone at the back. And then there's the largest one ever attempted, El Gigante, a colossus that was never meant to stand. The tools are gone, the workers never came back. It's as if the work stopped suddenly, everywhere. This wasn't a planned halt, it was an abandonment. The cultural engine just ran out of fuel or will or both. The silence in that quarry, it's louder than any fallen statue. It marks the moment the great project ended. Now you dig deeper into the soil across the island, and the timeline gets clearer. Archaeologists at the old village sites, they find distinct layers. In the lower, older layers, there's evidence of bustling life, stone tools for carving, bone fishhooks, a diversity of food remains. Then, as you move up through the strata, there's a shift. The layers become rich with charcoal, not from one fire but from centuries of burning, and mixed in are countless fragments of obsidian tools, the mata. That indicates a period of intense, maybe frantic, activity. People were processing what was left, making tools, burning the last of the woody vegetation. And then, above that, a different layer, a layer of sterile soil with almost no artifacts, a layer of quiet. That sequence tells a story, prosperity, then a surge of desperate consumption, and then silence. Some of the most elegant proof comes from the trees themselves. No giant palm trunks are left above ground, but the earth preserved their memory. In some areas, volcanic eruptions or mudflows covered the landscape long ago. When scientists looked at these ancient flows, they found something. Hollow spaces in the rock, perfectly shaped like palm nuts and root systems. They're called casts. Molds left by organic material that decayed away millennia ago. By filling these casts with plaster, researchers made perfect replicas of the nuts, the roots. It was physical, undeniable proof of a forest that once was. You could hold the ghost of a tree in your hand. That evidence moved the story from legend into natural history. The forest wasn't a myth, it was real and it was gone. And then there are the rats. The later layers in many sites are filled with their bones, millions of them. The Polynesian rat, the Kior, came with the first settlers, stowed away in their canoes. In a balanced ecosystem, their numbers would have been controlled by predators, by limited food. But on Rapa Nui, with no natural predators and an initial abundance, palm nuts, birds, crops, their population exploded. They became an ecological force. They gnawed on palm nuts, preventing new trees. They devoured the eggs and chicks of ground-nesting birds. They raided food stores. The sheer volume of their bones in the record paints a picture, an ecosystem completely overrun. They weren't the cause of the collapse, but they were a powerful accelerator. A multiplier of human impact, chewing through the island's last chances for regeneration. Each of these discoveries is a single piece, the abandoned quarry. The charcoal layers, the palm nut casts, the mountains of rat bones, alone they're just curious facts, but assembled they click together into a devastatingly clear picture. It's a pattern: expansion, intensive resource use, systematic depletion. The society didn't fail because of a curse or an invasion. It crafted its own decline. Step by step, generation by generation, until one day the work in the quarry stopped for good. The evidence in the soil is a ledger, a final accounting of what was used and what was lost. The island had another character, the Polynesian rat. It wasn't native, it came as a stowaway, probably in the hulls of those first canoes, hiding in the food stores. To the people, just a nuisance, but on an island with no mammalian predators, it was a biological time bomb. Released into a paradise, their population exploded. They became an ecological force, a multiplier of human impact, and their role in the collapse, it's a lesson in unintended consequences. Take the giant palm forest. For it to survive, new trees had to grow. The palms produced these large, nutritious nuts. In a healthy system, some would germinate, become the next generation. But the rats found them a perfect, abundant food source. Research suggests they consumed nuts in staggering numbers. They didn't just eat a few, they likely devoured the vast majority, systematically preventing forest regeneration from the ground up. It's possible the rats didn't just assist the deforestation. They may have been the primary reason the palms went extinct for good. Even if people had stopped cutting trees, the forest might never have returned. The rats had eaten its future. Their impact rippled outward. The island was a sanctuary for nesting seabirds. Many nested on the ground, in burrows or simple scrapes. Their eggs, their helpless chicks, defenseless against a swarm of climbing rodents. The rats became egg predators on an industrial scale. Each colony raided was another link in the food web, severed. They also targeted seedlings of other plants, further simplifying the landscape. What people did with axes and fire, the rats completed with their teeth. A silent, creeping consumption, day and night, out of sight. Here's the critical twist. The settlers didn't just cut down trees. They unknowingly introduced an agent that made regrowth nearly impossible. It was a 1-2 punch. First, the direct human use for statues, canoes, fuel. Then, the indirect biological lock placed by the rats. The forest wasn't just harvested. Its very ability to reproduce was cut off. That turned a manageable resource into a non-renewable one. Every tree that fell was now, effectively, gone forever. The rats accelerated the ecological death spiral, tightened the timeline of collapse. It reframes the tragedy. It wasn't merely a story of human short-sightedness. It was a cascade. interconnected events where a single, small introduction, something that seemed harmless, amplified every other bad decision. The rats were like a spark in a room slowly filling with gas. The people were turning the valves. The eventual outcome was almost chemical in its inevitability. The lesson is about systems, how one change, however small, can reverberate through an entire closed environment, magnifying other pressures until the whole structure buckles. The rats remind us that collapse is rarely about one cause. It's about chains of cause and effect, where the most destructive links are sometimes the ones we never see coming. This pattern of ecological overshoot, it's not just that island in the Pacific. You see a very similar story on a much larger scale in the jungles of Central America. The classic Maya. For centuries, they built these towering pyramids out of limestone. They had a complex writing system, advanced mathematics, a remarkably precise calendar. Their cities, places like Tikal, were major urban centers. Tens of thousands of people lived there. And then, between the 8th and 10th centuries, their southern heartland collapsed. The cities were abandoned. They stopped building monuments. The population fell dramatically. The parallels to Rapa Nui are strong. Both were societies that reached incredible heights, and both faced the same set of converging pressures. The first was population growth. The Maya population in the classic period grew significantly, likely into the millions across the region. To feed that many people, they pushed their agriculture to the limit. They cleared huge areas of jungle for slash-and-burn farming. They built terraces, wetland fields to intensify production, but that came at a cost. Tropical soils, once you strip the forest, are fragile. They erode quickly, they lose their nutrients. Over time, the land's productivity declined. The foundation of their abundance began to wear thin. Then came the deforestation. The Maya needed wood for building their cities, for making lime plaster, which required burning limestone in huge, fuel-hungry kilns, and for daily cooking fires. Pollen records from Maya lakes tell the same story. A steady decline in tree pollen replaced by grasses and weeds. They were clearing their landscape, and that altered the local climate. Less forest meant less moisture held in the air and soil. It made them more vulnerable to the third pressure, severe, prolonged drought. Climate scientists have reconstructed the rainfall patterns from stalagmites in caves there. The layers in those formations act like tree rings, recording wet and dry years. The data shows a series of multi-decade droughts that hit the Maya lowlands right at the time of their collapse. These weren't minor dry spells. They were catastrophic failures of the rains that fed their reservoirs and their crops. A society already straining its agricultural base had no buffer left. The result was famine, social unrest, a breakdown in the authority of the kings who claimed to control the weather that led to the fourth parallel, intensified warfare. Social fragmentation. In the final centuries, the record shows a grim shift. Fortifications appear around cities. Their texts speak more of capture and conflict than of alliance. The warfare became more frequent, more destructive, a struggle over dwindling resources and declining legitimacy. The great collaborative projects, the pyramid building, the carving of monuments to honor kings slowed and then stopped. Just as the Moai were left in the quarry, the Maya left their last monuments unfinished. The social contract, the belief system that held everything together, shattered under the strain. So is Easter Island unique in its isolation, in its scale, yes, but as a case study in a recurring pattern, it's not an anomaly. It's a stark, simplified example of a cycle you see across history. The specifics change: palms versus tropical hardwoods, an ocean island versus a continental region, but the underlying dynamics are familiar. Population growth pushes against environmental limits. Intensive resource use degrades the very systems that support life. A changing climate acts as a trigger on an already weakened structure. Social cohesion fractures. Cooperation turns into conflict. This comparative view is crucial. It moves the story of Rapa Nui from an isolated tragedy to a universal warning. The sustainability challenge isn't a modern invention. It's a fundamental test that complex societies have faced again and again. Some navigated it, some did not. The silent Moai and the empty Maya plazas ask us the same question. How do you build a civilization that can endure not just for generations, but for centuries? One that understands its foundations are not infinite, but have to be tended, protected, renewed. That rock out in the ocean, it's a mirror. It shows us our own world with a kind of terrifying clarity. The story of Rapa Nui isn't just history, it's a parable for right now. A microcosm, because in their story you see the basic challenge of our whole global civilization, just written small. The island had finite resources. It was a single, closed system. They couldn't import more timber or more soil or more birds. They had what was there and they used it. Our planet Earth is a closed system too. One atmosphere, one supply of fresh water, a finite amount of good land, a limited capacity for the ocean to take our waste. We also can't import more. We're living on an island in space. The scale is totally different, but the principle is the same. There's a carrying capacity, a limit to what the system can give and absorb sustainably. The people of Rapa Nui lived like their resources were infinite, right up until they weren't. And don't we do the same? Look at the clans on the island. The Mata, they competed with each other, building bigger statues to prove their power. That rivalry wasn't malicious, it was cultural. It was the game they all agreed to play. But that competition drove them to overuse the very forest they all needed. Now look at our world. Modern nations compete for economic growth, for influence, for control of resources. That competition is cultural too. It's the game we've all agreed to play. Gross domestic product has to go up, markets have to expand, consumption is celebrated as a sign of prosperity. But this relentless pursuit, this global statue-building cult of economic growth, it's consuming the foundations of our own planetary island. The forests, the fisheries, the stable climate, the good soil. We're all cutting down our last trees just on a slower, grander scale. The competition makes it so hard for any one player to stop. If one clan had stopped building Moai, they would have lost status. Lost power. If one nation today scaled back its consumption for the environment, it might fear losing its economic standing. The trap is identical, and then there's the isolation. The Rapa Nui had nowhere to go. When their resources ran low, they couldn't sail somewhere to trade for wood or food. They were truly alone with what they'd done. For a long time, humanity hasn't felt that isolation. We've explored, we have global trade. If we exhaust one fishery, we move to another. If we ruin farmland in one place, we import food from somewhere else. That created an illusion of an endless frontier, but that frontier is closing. We're managing the planet as a whole now. There is no new island. There's no backup Earth. We are becoming, in effect, as isolated as they were. The consequences of what we're all doing are now circling the globe. Climate change. Ocean acidification, mass extinction. We can't escape to a new planet. We have to make it work here. That's the sobering power of their story. It strips away the complexity and shows the core equation. A growing population plus a culture that rewards using up finite resources inside a closed system leads to collapse. It's a mathematical certainty if the variables don't change. The Rapa Nui changed the variables too late. Their world was small, so the collapse happened over a few centuries. Ours is bigger, so the timeline is longer. But the pattern is there. Are we the clans still competing on the beach, carving bigger symbols of our success while the forest behind us just disappears? Or can we, seeing their story so clearly, choose something else? Their Moai stand there, silent sentinels, not of a past mystery, but of a future we still have the power to shape. A society's resilience is measured at its breaking point. You look at Rapa Nui and you wonder, could they have changed course? With hindsight, you can trace the timeline. You can see forks in the path, moments where a different decision might have led to a different island. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding choice within a culture. The weight of tradition. Consider a simple idea, a cultural taboo. In many Polynesian societies, practices were governed by sacred restrictions called kapu. What if a chief or priest had declared the largest palms or the last grove in a valley to be kapu, off limits, a spiritual safeguard for the physical world? It's a thought. Such a taboo might have preserved a seed bank, a genetic reservoir for the forest to recover, but the evidence says no such prohibition took hold. Why not? Because the demand for that wood was central to their most sacred practice, the erection of Moai. The spiritual power of the statues and the physical power of the trees were directly linked. To taboo the trees might have been seen as tabooing the ancestors themselves. Their cultural framework, so brilliant in uniting them, created a profound rigidity. Or the competition itself. Could the clans have shifted to a less destructive form of status rivalry earlier? A contest of horticulture, maybe, growing the largest sweet potato. Or a competition in weaving, or in chanting complex genealogies. These would have required far fewer physical resources, but the Moai cult was not just a game. It was their cosmology made stone. It answered deep questions about power, lineage, humanity's place in the world. To abandon it for a potato-growing contest would have required a spiritual revolution. A complete reimagining of their relationship with the gods and with each other. That is a transformation few societies manage without a severe crisis forcing it. And by the time the crisis was undeniable, it was likely too late to organize such a shift. This touches on societal resilience, the capacity of a culture to absorb disturbance, to adapt, to transform when necessary. The Rapa Nui civilization showed incredible resilience in some ways. They developed stone gardens, they invented the Birdman cult, but in the core matter of their resource use, they were locked in. Scholars call this path dependency, like a wagon rolling down a deeply rutted road. Each turn of the wheel follows the groove carved by previous turns. The initial choice to build monumental statues set them on a path. Every generation that followed invested more energy, more identity into that path. The ruts grew deeper. Steering onto a new, uncharted trail became exponentially harder. Their story is a lesson in the inertia of success. The very beliefs and practices that brought them prosperity and unity became the obstacles to change when the environment shifted. The system couldn't correct itself. There was no feedback mechanism strong enough to override the cultural imperative to build. This invites a reflection for us. We live within our own powerful cultural frameworks. Our global society is built on narratives of endless growth, consumption, competition. These narratives have brought astounding advances. But they, too, are carving deep ruts. When we see warnings, climate data, extinction rates, resource depletion, do our institutions and values allow us to pivot? Are we flexible enough to question the core tenets of our own success before a crisis forces our hand? The silence of the Quarry asks us not about their failure, but about our own capacity for foresight. To see the ruts in our own road and to find the collective will to steer a new course while we still have time to turn. There are the fallen statues. The Birdman carvings on the rocks, and then there's the wood, the Rongorongo. These glyphs on wooden tablets, lines of symbols, birds, plants, human shapes that seem to flow. It's a script, a real writing system, and it's never been read. To hold one is to hold a book you can't open. A voice speaking without a key, that alone changes the old story. This wasn't some primitive place. They had writing, a tradition, a way to keep records, to hold thought in physical form. These aren't just pictures. The signs repeat, they fall into patterns, it's complex, it could be a sacred chant, it could be poetry, fixed there on the wood, so the question is what's written. What's on those pages? The possibility is there a first-hand account, from the people who saw the island change. They could be genealogies, lists of chiefs going back to the first canoes. They could be ritual texts, how to raise a Moai, how to crown the Birdman, or they could be about the land itself, a record of the ecology, a lament for the forests that were gone. A warning about the birds disappearing, the rains failing. They might even describe the conflict, the statues being pulled down, written by someone who was there. We'll probably never know because most of the tablets are gone, lost after the Europeans came, burned for firewood, taken away as souvenirs. The readers, the ones who knew, they died in all that turmoil. The knowledge died with them. Now there are just a few tablets left in museums, fragments of a whole library that's lost. That silence means something. It means we only have one side of the story. We have the archaeology, the bones, the pollen, the stone tools, but we don't have their words, we don't have their testimony. About their world, their choices, what they feared, how they understood what was happening to them. That changes how you see them. They weren't just passive. They were watching, they were thinking, they were likely writing their own history as it was unfolding. During the hardest parts, the Rongorongo shows something. Collapse isn't about a lack of sophistication. A civilization can be advanced. It can create magnificent art. It can have a written language, and it can still make choices that unravel its future. The silence of the glyphs sits next to the silence of the quarry. One is a work that stopped. The other is a story we can't hear anymore. Together, they tell you to listen differently. Not just to the evidence in the ground, but to the stories people tell about themselves, and to wonder which of our own stories will one day be just as hard to understand. But the story didn't end with the silence. A people can't be erased by the past. The Rapa Nui survived. They endured the darkest parts of the 19th century, the sickness and the raids, and they clung to their land with a tenacity that defied every prediction they would disappear. Their population, once reduced to a heartbreaking low, began a slow climb back. They weren't a relic, they were a community determined to persist. Then in 1888, their island was formally annexed by Chile. It was a transaction made without their consent, a distant government claiming a homeland they had nurtured for centuries, and for decades the island was leased to a foreign sheep ranching company. The Rapa Nui were confined to the small town of Hangaroa while sheep grazed over the rest of their ancestral land. It was a new kind of isolation imposed from the outside. But even within those confines, the culture was kept alive, in whispers, in family stories, in the rhythms of a language that refused to die. So the fight for autonomy became the next chapter. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, the Rapa Nui have engaged in a sustained, peaceful struggle for self-determination, for the protection of their territory. They've advocated for control over migration to the island, for safeguarding their archaeological heritage from unsustainable tourism, for a true political voice in their own future. This isn't a rejection of the modern world. It's an assertion of their right to meet it on their own terms, to decide how the legacy of their ancestors is shared and how their living culture grows. And today, that culture is experiencing a powerful renaissance. There's a vibrant grassroots movement to revitalize the Rapa Nui language, teaching it to a new generation in schools. Traditional arts, dance, music, tattooing, they're not museum pieces. They're living practices, evolving and full of meaning. The knowledge of the elders is being recorded, valued, woven back into daily life. And the Moai themselves are part of this revival. Several of the great ahu have been carefully restored by archaeological teams, often in collaboration with the community. The statues have been re-erected, their blank eyes once again gazing inland, but they're no longer seen just as symbols of a mysterious, dead civilization. They are understood as living ancestors, as tangible connections to a lineage that was never truly broken. They stand not as a warning of failure, but as a testament to endurance. That's the crucial, hopeful correction to the old narrative. The ancient political system collapsed, the ecological balance was shattered, but the people and their culture did not vanish. They passed through a bottleneck of unimaginable hardship, and they emerged. They adapted. They found new forms of expression, like the Birdman cult in the past, and new forms of resistance and renewal in the present. Their identity, forged in the voyage across the Pacific and tempered by the trials of their island, proved to be their most resilient resource of all. So the story of Rapa Nui isn't a simple tale of rise and fall. It's a more complex, more human story of transformation. It's about the catastrophic cost of disconnection from the environment, yes. But it's also about the unbreakable strength of cultural memory and the enduring will of a people to reclaim their narrative, to honor their past while forging their future. The Moai don't just look back, they stand as guardians for a people who are very much alive, speaking their own name into the wind once more. The story of Rapa Nui isn't a straight line. It's a web. You have to see the whole system to understand it. A system is just parts that interact, and on that island, everything was connected. Those connections created cycles. Loops that either built things up or tore them down. To see the tragedy, you have to see these loops. It turns a list of events into one single process. Take one powerful cycle, a reinforcing loop. It started with population growth. More people meant more hands to carve and move the statues. The statues were spiritual and social power. So more statues brought more prestige to the clans. That prestige encouraged having more children to strengthen the lineage, which meant, in time, an even larger population. This was a virtuous cycle for a while. It built their civilization, their culture, their achievements, but it was also an engine. It constantly demanded more resources to run. Now follow the resource thread. More statues required more trees. For rollers, ropes, levers, cutting trees meant less forest. Less forest had multiple effects. It caused soil to wash away, reducing crops. It meant no large timber for ocean canoes, cutting off deep-sea fishing, so you had less food from land and sea. At the same time, bird populations collapsed without tree cover and from the rats, so even more food sources vanished. This created a balancing loop. A corrective force, resource depletion acted as a brake on population and statue building, but the cruel twist was timing. By the time this balancing loop kicked in strongly, the damage was already profound. The system entered a new phase. With less food, hardship increased. This hardship strained the social fabric. The cooperation needed to move statues or manage resources broke down. Competition turned into conflict. That conflict prevented any large-scale response to the crisis. They couldn't come together to replant trees or manage fisheries because they were fighting over the last sweet potatoes. So the conflict loop reinforced the scarcity, which intensified the conflict. It was a trap. That's systems thinking, seeing how a decision in one area ripples out. Cutting a tree for a statue roller doesn't just mean one less tree. It means slightly more soil erosion, a tiny reduction in future canoe capability, a minuscule loss of bird habitat. These small effects accumulate across hundreds of decisions over centuries. The people making each choice likely saw only the immediate benefit. Moving the statue, gaining status, the long-term, indirect consequences were invisible, lost in the complexity of the web. For us, this is the lesson. Our world is a far more complex web of social, economic, and ecological systems. We face climate change, biodiversity loss, resource inequality. These aren't separate problems. They are symptoms of the same systemic reality. Our modern statues might be economic growth metrics, consumption patterns, short-term political wins. The trees we are cutting are the planet's life support systems, and just like on Rapa Nui, the feedback loops are at work. Our reinforcing loops of consumption and growth push the system. The balancing loops, climate disasters, social unrest, resource crises, are the planet's response. The warning of the Moai isn't that we are doomed to repeat their fate. It's that we must learn to see as they could not, to perceive the interconnections, to ask not just what an action achieves today, but what cycles it strengthens or weakens for tomorrow. It calls for a shift from seeing isolated parts to understanding the whole living system. The silence of the island is a question. Can we, with all our knowledge, learn to listen to the feedback before the only sound left is the wind over barren stone? Leadership is a story of vision but also constraints. On Rapa Nui, the chiefs and priests had immense authority. Their mana was the glue. It mobilized people to carve the Moai, to move them. They were custodians of tradition, interpreters of the ancestors' will. But as the ecological crisis deepened, that tradition may have become a cage. Imagine a chief generations in looking at the thinning groves. The signs were there, smaller catches, gardens needing more walls, whispers of hunger. He likely saw them, but his power, his legitimacy was tied to the project, to call for a halt to statue construction, to redirect labor toward planting trees or building soil. That would have been radical. It would have meant telling people their sacred work was harming them. It would have risked his clan's status, invited challenges from rivals still building. The incentives were misaligned. Short-term prestige, another giant Moai, was tangible, immediate. The long-term health of the forest was abstract, a problem for future generations. In that gap, leadership may have faltered. This points to a structural issue, the tragedy of the commons. The island's resources, the forest, the seabirds, the soil, were a common pool. They belonged to everyone and thus to no one. Each clan, acting in its own interest, had an incentive to harvest as much as they could, as fast as they could. If one clan showed restraint, others would take what was left. There was no overarching authority, no island-wide council to set limits, to enforce them. The political structure was likely a federation of competing clans, not a unified kingdom that made collective action nearly impossible. Agreeing to shared sacrifice, to forego immediate gain for a distant benefit, is one of humanity's hardest political tasks. It requires trust, communication, enforcement. On Rapa Nui, as resources dwindled, that trust evaporated. Cooperation fractured into competition. The commons were exploited to exhaustion. The silence of the Quarry, then, isn't just an artistic stop, it's a political failure, a failure to evolve governance structures that could manage scarcity. The chiefs were likely trapped within the system they led. Their role was to compete within the game, not to change its rules. By the time the rules were clearly leading to ruin, the social capital needed to rewrite them was gone. The society had become factions, each guarding its last chicken fort or garden plot, unable to mount a unified response to the disaster they all faced. This ancient dilemma echoes today. We face our own global commons crisis. The atmosphere, the oceans, the great forests, these are our shared, finite resources. And we are organized into a federation of competing nations, each with its own priorities, its own political cycles, its own incentive to prioritize short-term growth over long-term planetary health. The challenge of forging binding agreements, of convincing nations to accept constraints for a common good, is the same collective action problem that likely paralyzed Rapa Nui's clans. Their island was a closed system with no higher authority. Our planet is now in the same position. The warning isn't about the failure of a specific leader. It's about the inherent difficulty of any political system to manage a slow-moving crisis when the rewards for inaction are immediate and the costs are deferred. The Moai ask us, can we build the institutions, the trust, the vision that they could not? Can we learn to govern our shared world before our common resources, like their last great palm, exist only in memory? That phrase, ecological suicide, it suggests a conscious choice, a decision to end their own world, but that's not quite accurate. It's a metaphor and it can mislead. The people of Rapa Nui didn't decide to destroy their home. They never voted for collapse. What they did was make thousands of small decisions. Each one was reasonable. Each one made sense in the moment, given what they knew, given what they valued. A chief needed to honor his ancestors, so he commissioned a statue. A family needed a home, so they cut trees for timber. A community needed to fish, so they built a canoe. Every action was logical, even necessary within their culture, within their immediate needs. The tragedy wasn't in the intent of any one choice. It was in the accumulation, the unseen accumulation of them all. That's the core of the story. It's a story about myopia, about short-sightedness. They lived on an island, but they couldn't see the whole island from the ground. They couldn't perceive the slow trends, the century-scale trends. The gradual thinning of the forest was invisible to a person living a single lifetime. The decline in soil depth happened over generations, and by the time the consequences were impossible to ignore, when the last big tree was gone, when the canoes could no longer be built, the momentum was too great. The options were too few. They were trapped by the success of their own past. This reframing is what makes it relevant, chillingly relevant to us. We are not so different. Our world is built on countless daily decisions, decisions that seem individually rational, even trivial, choosing a less expensive product without considering its environmental cost, prioritizing short-term economic growth over long-term health, voting for policies that deliver immediate benefits while deferring the complex challenges. No single person making these choices intends to harm the planet. No boardroom sets out to cause a crisis, yet collectively, these decisions create trends. Powerful trends in carbon emissions, in resource depletion, in habitat loss. We, too, can struggle to see the whole system from our individual vantage points. The feedback is delayed, the data is complex, the real cost of our convenience is often hidden, paid by distant ecosystems or by future generations. So the lesson of Rapa Nui is not a judgment on a failed people, it's a mirror held up to a fundamental challenge, the challenge of complex societies. How do you align short-term incentives with long-term survival? How do you make the health of the commons compelling, as immediate as the next quarterly report? As the next election cycle, their story warns us about disconnection, the disconnect between action and consequence, between the present and the future. They could not see the threads connecting the quarry to the empty lagoon, the statue to the starving child. Our task, with all our science, with all our communication, is to learn to see those threads. To understand that our island is planetary, that the choices we make today are still carving the world our grandchildren will inherit. The Moai do not accuse us. They simply ask us to look not just at their fallen forms, but at the pattern that led them there, a pattern we are still weaving, thread by thread. Every single day, the stone faces look away from the ocean. They look inland over the hills, the fields, the world they made, a world that couldn't hold the ambition that carved them. That's the final picture, not of a stupid people, not a cursed one, a capable society. They did what seems impossible. They thrived in isolation. They made art on a staggering scale. They adapted again and again. Their failure wasn't a lack of intelligence or spirit, it was perception, a collective inability to see the whole island. The entire system, to understand its gifts, were not infinite. They couldn't see the slow line until they'd crossed it, and then there was no way back. The lessons aren't complicated, they're stark. First, know your world, truly know it. Understand the resources you depend on, not as abstract numbers. As living, interconnected systems, the forest wasn't just wood, it was soil, water, birds, canoes. Second, listen to the whispers, the early warnings. The thinning grove, the smaller catch, the soil washing away after rain. These aren't minor inconveniences, it's the system speaking, pleading for a change in course. Third, measure success differently. If your culture rewards only short-term gains, another statue, another quarter of growth, it will consume its future. True prestige has to link to stewardship, to leaving the land richer for the next generation. And finally, build flexibility into your institutions. A society that can't question its own core practices, that can't adapt when the old ways stop working, is riding a sled toward a cliff. The fate of Rapa Nui was a choice, 1,000 small choices, not a pre-written destiny, and that's what makes it urgent, personal. We stand on our own island. Our beautiful, finite planet. We're making our own 1,000 small choices every day. We have the same capacity for brilliance, the same tendency toward myopia. Their fallen giants are a mirror. They ask us to see the connections we ignore, to value the quiet health of the systems that sustain us over the loud trophies of momentary success. They're a haunting monument, but not to a forgotten mystery, a monument to consequence, to the truth that we are part of our environment, not separate. What we take, we must also replenish. What we build must not undermine the ground it stands on. The silent Moai don't speak of ancient failure. They speak to a future we're still creating. They urge us to listen to the science, to the land, to the quiet signals of a stressed world, and to choose a different path while we still have time to turn.